Today I'm speaking with Dr. Valerie Tarico. Dr. Tarico, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on. It's an honor.
And for anyone who doesn't know Dr. Tarico, just going to give a brief bio and then ask Dr. Tarico to give a little bit of the personal side of what else she does. But Dr. Tarico is a psychologist, freelance advocate, a writer. She's a former evangelical, promoting free thought and working to undermine the corrosive power of biblical literalism. From Seattle, if I'm correct, and a graduate of Wheaton College, which a lot of us have heard about or even gone to. The University of Iowa is where she got her PhD in counseling psychology. And in addition, you completed postdoctoral studies at the University of Washington. Is that correct?
That's right.
And then Dr. Tarico joined the staff of Children's Hospital Medical Center in Seattle and ran the Children's Behavior and Learning Clinic in Bellevue, Washington, and then moved on to private practice. And she is a social commentator, writing about issues such as Christian fundamentalism, the role of women in society, reproductive rights and health, contraceptive technologies, and the intersection of all of these items. And her articles appear in many different venues, including books such as Beyond Belief and the Prometheus Counter-Apologetics Trilogy, edited by John Loftus. She's also the author of Trusting Doubt, a former evangelical looks at old beliefs in a new light, and another book called Deus and Other Imaginings. Did I pronounce that correctly, by the way?
Diaz.
Diaz, okay. And I wanted to ask before I finish the bio, what does the word Diaz mean in that context?
It's just an abbreviated form of ideas. So
Okay.
the book contains stories that I wrote for my daughters while they were growing up, and one of them is about ideas that creative ideas that acquire physical substance.
Oh, nice. Like they just kind of come to life?
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. And Dr. Tarico, in her books, she's exploring moral and rational inconsistencies in fundamentalist Christian traditions and offers personal insights into the application of constructive curiosity to our most closely guarded beliefs. She's actively engaged in interspiritual dialogue that aims to find common ground in humanity's shared moral core. And she's the founder of wisdomcommons.org, an interactive site that allows users to find and discuss information about virtues that are valued across different traditions. And I've got a few more things, but for the sake of time, I'm going to ask, could you just tell us a little bit more about anything else I missed or got wrong? And also, could you tell us a bit more about what else you do besides all the professional aspects of your life?
Well, I should start by confessing that the Wisdom Commons is not currently active because it needs to be rebuilt, and I haven't yet found the right path for doing that.
Okay.
But although I continue to have a strong interest in and a passion for kind of what are the principles or values or virtues that constitute humanity's shared moral core, the things that we care about across different wisdom traditions and across cultural traditions and across societies. I think that when you find that kind of convergence, then you find things that have durable value in terms of promoting well-being. And so speaking of promoting well-being, I guess when you ask about my kind of avocational interests in the last 2 years, I would say 3 years, I, along with my 2 adult daughters and husband, have all gotten very interested in the future of food and what it will mean to replace our system of animal husbandry that involves factory farming. Has been called by some philosophers a suffering maximizer. What it might mean to replace that with other forms of agriculture and with plant-based protein production and cellular agriculture, in a way that allows us to really unplug sentient beings from the food production and the protein production chain specifically. So that means kind of staying abreast of some research and innovations in cellular agriculture and in making investments in that area, and also working with a ranch project up in British Columbia that is kind of on the cutting edge of regenerative agriculture, kind of with, humane certifications and stuff. So saying, if we are going to raise animals for food, what does it mean to do that in the most humane way possible?
Does some of what you're looking at involve, like, I've heard of companies like Beyond Meat and other groups like that are, I guess, different plant-based processes that make it look like meat or taste like meat?
Well, and so we're not investors specifically in Beyond Meat, but yes, exactly. That is part of the picture, I think. And, the advantage of cellular agriculture, where you're actually taking animal cells and then replicating them within the context of a bioreactor, or as there's a new company, called Perfect Day, that is basically getting microorganisms to produce milk proteins in a bioreactor. So it's like a brewery, that's doing the work that would otherwise be done in a cow's stomach. And right now, what we mostly have is cows that are just tethered in buildings where they have a feed trough in front of them and then are producing milk. But increasingly, we again have the capacity to do that without having to have the brain and the body of the cow there, right? And to kind of and to be violating whatever the impulse and instincts and preferences and intentions of that sentient being might otherwise be. With the plant-based stuff, like like Beyond, which our family consumes quite a bit of, I have to say, one of the advantages of that over cellular agriculture, over kind of trying to figure out how do we create in a laboratory scaffolding that will grow meat cells, beef cells, or chicken cells, or whatever it is. The advantages of plant-based alternatives is that over time we're not tethered to kind of what the limitations were of animal-based meat production. So you can do all kinds of things with texture and with flavor and things like that aren't actually possible if you're just simply replicating, even in the most advanced way possible, meat cells, right? And I think that a lot of us have a strong preference at this point, I do, for things that taste like the familiar kinds of meat that we grew up eating. But I think over time, who knows the directions that the production and preferences will actually drift once they're untethered from those limitations.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it sounds like too it's a good way to address some of the ethical concerns about all this and the way animals were treated. So that's awesome. Could I ask, in addition to that, I always try to squeeze in a quick icebreaker. Do you and your family have a favorite card or board game that you like to play? Like Parcheesi or Clue?
I mean, I am pretty verbal in my reasoning, and I have a total soft spot for bananagrams, which my family tolerates. They are much more interested in strategy games, but one of our favorites together as a family is Dixit. If you have seen that, it's got amazing, fantastical cards, and they are kind of approximately representing ideas or images, and then you're kind of working to communicate indirectly through those whimsical, surreal cards, and so it's like an artistic experience at the same time that it's a mental challenge.
Very cool. I'll have to look that up. Dixit. Very cool. Well, I appreciate that. I'll look that up and try to get that. Basically, what I wanted to start with, I know you've done a lot of research and work, and I would like to, if I could follow up with you down the line about more of the research, but I wanted to just ask more about your story. I know you've shared this before, so I hope it isn't too redundant, but I'd love to just hear more about where you're coming from with all this, because it's pretty evident from your websites and from your videos. I've seen a lot of them. You're coming from a heart of a passion for getting the truth out to people, helping people to think through these issues more clearly about religion and about its impacts. And so I just wanted to ask kind of where your story started from with all this. So I wanted to ask, if I could, just to start with, what was your childhood and background like, and what was your exposure to Christianity like?
So the way I've told my story many times is that I grew up in a devout evangelical family. The church that I was raised in, Scottsdale Bible Church, is now an evangelical megachurch. And my parents were there at the very founding of that. So I accepted Jesus as my savior as a young child because hell was a scary place. And I probably accepted Jesus as my savior more than once just to make sure that it took, because hell was a scary place, right?
Yep.
And I think that people who are outside of Christianity don't necessarily attend to how threatening some of the stories in Christianity are that we tell our children. I mean, one of the most obvious, of course, is the Noah's Ark story, where God is like literally drowning every single human being, including all the babies and the fetuses, kind of, and yet people who kind of are concerned about abortion don't really process it in that way. And but a lot of the stories are remarkably violent. My daughters, who I didn't raise within Christianity, were horrified when I decided that it was time to read them Bible stories to help them kind of be familiar with some of the narratives and deep mythologies that are so woven into the fabric of our culture. But coming back to my own childhood, so I grew up going to Sunday school and Bible study, kind of at church 2 times a day on Sundays and once on Wednesday night, and then kind of sometimes an additional Bible study. I took my Christianity very seriously, and so of my own volition, I was a camp counselor for Child Evangelism Fellowship. I participated in something called the I Found It campaign, which was a phone banking crusade, I guess. Went to something called the Bill Gothard Seminar, which was this traveling show of kind of, fundamentalist teachings that toured the country during the 70s and 80s. Chose to go to Wheaton College of Billy Graham fame, and spent time in Colombia on a Wycliffe base in the jungle there briefly, working with their translators, doing mostly stenography. But all of which is just to say, Christianity was the heart of my worldview. It was the heart of who I perceived myself to be. It was what I kind of saw as both my social community, my spiritual community, and the center of the goodness in the world. And yet, even so, there were challenges, I think, in my own life that bumped me up against some of the limitations of that. So as a teenager, I have a sister with a severe anorexic eating disorder, and I developed bulimia and was horribly ashamed of that, and asked people, youth ministers, to help me pray it away, essentially, which didn't work because that often doesn't work. And ultimately, as a sophomore at Wheaton College, made a serious suicide attempt and ended up in a psychiatric hospital for almost a month. And in that context, I kind of shifted my worldview some in the sense that I decided that, there are prayers God wants us to answer ourselves, right? So we don't pray for God to heal broken bones. We go to the doctor and expect the doctor to set them. And I decided that the same thing was true of mental health treatments and interventions, that God had given us our minds, each other, a set of tools in the physical world with which to address a number of the problems around us. And so that was a serious shift in my worldview. And I would say there were cracks in my evangelical fundamentalism even before that. I had a dear friend, Kay, in grade school and high school, who I was Mormon, and I couldn't really understand how to be okay with the fact that she was going to be tortured forever when she was a better person than I was. So there was this kind of struggle, I think, taking things seriously enough that you start bumping up against the inconsistencies. And then, over time, in the coming years, as I finished my degree at Wheaton College, developing a more and more idiosyncratic form of Christianity, even as I was teaching Sunday school at a Presbyterian church and continuing to take Bible classes and such, but finding that I needed to not treat the Bible as the literally perfect word of God in order to be able to stay a Christian, and also finding that, how would I say this? I guess, so not just not treating the Bible as a literally perfect word of God, but I think that in some ways, the domain of Christianity in my life began shrinking. And I also found myself over time resenting the incessant sermonizing and moralizing of pastors who, perhaps it was arrogance, but didn't seem to know a whole lot more about the subject than I did. And I felt like if I wasn't living up to what it meant to kind of honor God, that it wasn't for lack of knowing, right? So that any deficits in my Christianity weren't from lack of having been exposed to the ideas. I got it. You don't need to tell me again. The struggles are other than that. So by the time I left Wheaton, I moved to Iowa City to go to grad school, and there I worshiped in the Catholic Newman Center, not because I was interested in the Catholic hierarchy, but because it was about liturgy and worship. It wasn't about having someone lecture at you. And even though I didn't find a lot of the teachings credible at that point, I did find the experience of worship particularly powerful, and I still very much believed in the Christian God. It wasn't until I finished grad school. Sometimes I think of myself as kind of a slow study. It wasn't until I finished grad school, went to Seattle, and then was working on a consult liaison service as part of my PhD in psychology. I was providing mental health services to families and children who were in children's hospitals for reasons of physical illness, and watching people try to make sense of the experience of being surrounded by children who were suffering unto death, children with cancer, children with other kinds of uncurable illnesses. And I think at that point, as I put it before, I got angry at the God in my head. I felt like I'd been kind of holding that God together for a long time now with duct tape and baling wire. And I got mad and I said, I'm not making excuses for you anymore. And then when I stopped making excuses, there just wasn't a whole lot left.
That's a great way to put it, the baling wire and duct tape. That's pretty much how it feels at the end for a lot of us.
Yeah. I think that's one thing that Christians miss. They think, there's this trope or kind of myth within evangelical Christianity that those of us who deconvert because we weren't committed in the first place, because we didn't take our faith seriously, because we hadn't actually accepted Jesus as our Savior, or whatever kind of that tradition, kind of the traditional kind of embrace of Christianity might be within a person's specific tradition. But my experience is that, in fact, quite often former Christians are people who are folks who took it very seriously. There are folks that are described as atheists, right? Who are, not religious believers because they're apathetic or indifferent. But there are a lot of us who it was our heart for God, and it was our yearning to kind of get it right and to know what was good and what was true and what it meant to live in moral community with other people, that's what ultimately brought us up against the contradictions, whether rational contradictions, historical contradictions, scientific contradictions, moral contradictions, that make Christianity untenable.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. And I think it's the people for whom it is so real, from their own fire for the Lord, so to speak. They're willing to lay down their lives for the cross. They're willing to go be missionaries. In some ways, it's harder because I think those of us who've been down that road and we're so committed, there's this kind of hidden message that we maybe could have admitted as Christians, but for sure I can see it on this side of it, that God can't be wrong. If there is an issue with your lack of joy, with your lack of your sense of, something's not right between me and God, if there's a distance feeling, a lack of peace, it can't be God's fault, because God's always there. He's always exhibiting his love. He's always doing the right thing. He's always good. And, God is good all the time. All the time, God is good. And so if there's an issue, if you're not feeling it, so to speak, it's you or your sin or your lack of commitment or lack of understanding. And it kind of just puts you in this tailspin of something doesn't feel right. It must be my fault. And so, okay, I think I get right with God, and then just cycles again. Something still doesn't feel right. It must be my fault, not God's. And you pretty much never put on your radar, maybe this, number one, maybe it's God's fault. And then number two, the more accurate question, maybe this isn't actually a God. Maybe this is just mythology. But it's amazing how hard it is to actually just face the real issue of, is this actually a real thing, or am I scrambling with my own psychology? It must have, hearing you talk about
No, that's a good way to put it.
I was going to say, speaking of psychology, hearing your story about the hospital and the kids, that must have been heartbreaking. I can't imagine some of the stuff you saw.
Yeah, like there was one little guy who had a 2-year-old, I think, with a spinal cord tumor. And the the odds of them successfully treating it and him not ultimately dying, I think, were low. I think it was metastatic, and his parents wanted to just take him home
Mm.
and love him until he he died. And even if they removed the tumor successfully and treated it, and it didn't metastasize further, he was going to be paraplegic for the rest of his life, but also go through immense suffering during the course of surgeries and other kinds of treatments. And, the hospital's ethical framework basically didn't give the parents the choice. And you look at that kind of suffering and you listen to people kind of say things like, the chaplain at the hospital, I remember, gave me a book called Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. And, you listen to people trying to explain that in the context of their belief in an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, interventionist deity, right? And so they have to come up with things like, well, maybe other people are benefiting from this child's suffering. Maybe it's going to bring other people to God. There's, look at how suffering kind of brings out sometimes the kindness and compassion in us. Or or of course, there's always the appeal to the great mystery, like, who are we to second guess God, right? God's ways are not our ways, or are unknowable. And you listen to that stuff, and I guess I found myself thinking that it all just sounded so hollow. It's like trying to justify to ourselves all of this suffering didn't make it just, right? None of us would make the decision for a child to suffer unto death for the benefit of other people. Right? I mean, there have been many cultures in the history of the world who did that, right? I mean, the Jesus as a human sacrifice comes out of such cultures. It is kind of an emergent product of those kinds of cultures as they evolved over time. But it doesn't make it just. And so ultimately I was left with just the sense that the justifications were distasteful. They were self-serving.
Yeah. Crazy. It's hard for me to even think about. I have 4 little kids, and the just even wrapping my mind around it is hard. You just want so much good for your kids, and to think about having to make some of those tough decisions, and just even if you don't have a decision to make, just to see your child stifled and in pain for so long it's hard to imagine. I did want to go back a few steps. You mentioned your parents were part of that church in Arizona. Were your parents then fundamentalist Christians?
They were. It's interesting. I'm in my mother's house right now in Arizona, having driven from Seattle to visit her because it's been a year and I kind of couldn't figure out what was the safest way to do that with her being here in her mid 80s now and living alone. That's a lot of isolation. And there are a lot of elderly people who have deteriorated because of that isolation, right? So I'm sitting in a house that is surrounded by Bibles and James Dobson books and, kind of you name it, right? She would buy the books of all of the people who came to preach at that church, Scottsdale Bible Church. And then she later shifted to something closer to home, Scottsdale Baptist. But yeah, my parents were very devoted. My father led a group called Boys Brigade, which was kind of a evangelical parallel to Boy Scouts, right?
Yeah.
And I was a pioneer girl, and we participated in the Bible Memory Association, and they were both sincerely true believers. Now, what I would say is my mom ascribes to a much softer, more open form of Christianity at this point, in part because I have a younger brother who's 20 years younger than me and who is gay and came out during high school when he was attending a Christian school. And I think because there is a kind of pattern of anxiety, depression in my family, in my maternal family, I think mom was more worried about the potential of him suiciding than she was about the potential of him being gay. And so and they got some great references to folks through the school who ended up also to kind of have a more open and affirming approach within Christianity to questions of sexual orientation. And then as a consequence, ultimately, I think over time, mom became uncomfortable with the explicit gay bashing in the community that she was a part of, and came up with an excuse kind of to go to a church, a Plymouth Congregational Church, and the excuse was that it was closer to home, right? I could walk there from where I'm sitting now. But in reality, it was just much more theologically comfortable for her as well. And so I think that kind of her love for David ended up ultimately being stronger than her attachment to some of the more ugly commitments of fundamentalist Christianity.
Could I ask, when you were growing up, when you were younger, did you recall any of these kind of skeptical doubts or just questioning the narrative in any way? Do you remember any of that popping up when you were, say, between 6 or 7 and when you were a teenager, or was it pretty much just all in, like this is truth, this God is God and Jesus is his son and the gospel's where it's at? Was it real to you in that sense? And did you recall any doubts, or was that pretty much a safe time in terms of you and Christianity?
Well, as I said, I think I accepted Jesus as my savior several times just to make sure it took. And I had my misgivings about other people I knew being tortured eternally, but I was pretty committed. And so I think that it's what you said, right? That as a consequence of being unable to question Christianity or the Christian God, I instead questioned myself. And I saw my inability to live a more spiritual life, including ultimately to kind of like not be bulimic, as personal failings.
Yeah. I know a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people I've spoken with have struggled a lot with the whole just theology that talks about, even though God technically loves you, the book is a story of his love, it's his love letter to us, that in a specific sense that he's saying to everyone, you're all condemned in sin, you're all bad, 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 and some of you I've given the gift of grace and faith to, and you can then come to me. But even though you are now this small narrow path of you that are in a right relationship with me, even you are upsetting me a lot because we're not in fellowship because of sin. And I know especially people with sexuality, that brings a lot of shame culture for various reasons. Do you feel like that was a big part of your experience? Or I know a lot of people feel like, no, I was more enveloped in the love part of it. Like what was that like for you growing up? Like did the preachers pound the pulpit when that one for you?
I mean, like there's this old Pat Benatar song about child abuse, and she says love and pain become one and the same in the eyes of a wounded child. And I think that in Christianity, it's like love and guilt become one and the same. Love and a sense of inadequacy become one and the same. Like, love and a kind of experience of personal failure, right? Of helplessness, of self-recrimination and judgment. So all of those things get bound together with this idea of love, and it's kind of messed up.
Yeah, that's a good. I agree, and I think that's what a lot of people from the outside that are still in Christianity, that are on the outside of circles we might move in, that they can't see it. They're like, how abusive is it to say God loves me? I mean, how abusive is that? Like I've had people even sarcastically be like, oh yeah, I'll never get over this horrible trauma of how much God loves me. And they can't see what's wrapped up in that. It's like, yes, God loves you, but you're implying God had to love you because he had to hate you first, and he still hates everybody else and all these other issues. And it's like, it might not be the the one statement that's the worst thing ever, but it's all the additional context to it and what it implies, and what is required by the gospel story, that is actually really traumatic. And for a lot of people, when you add in certain specifics, it's almost ultra traumatic. I feel like for me, it wasn't as traumatic as some people when you add in the guilt stuff that I've been mentioning, but also stuff like, you didn't mention this name, but I was thinking of Tim LaHaye. If you start, dropping Left Behind, and oh no, I might wake up someday and my parents are gone because they got raptured and I didn't, and I might live to see the tribulation and have to go through all that. All these issues, and or maybe the Frank Peretti, the demons that are all around us. You add in a bunch of little dynamics, and it gets very complicated and very nasty. And I mean, if it's really, if it's not really, it's like, oh, it's interesting. But if you really believe it's really happening, it's a lot to unwind. It's pretty much a Gordian knot for a lot of us. And I feel like a lot of people too don't understand. The Christians don't seem to understand how much that stuff can be honestly triggering. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I get someone who responds to a video or sends me a message and tries to present the gospel again, which isn't very often, ironically, but when it does happen, some things are like, ooh, that kind of almost smarts a little bit. Like, wow, this is poison. Like, you're trying to put poison darts in me again. Do you ever deal with people that are kind of, you can tell they're almost triggered by some of that stuff?
Oh, yes. So less so like Marlene Winnell, who has a clinical practice in this area, right? She works with people who have literal post-traumatic symptoms related to some of that stuff. You mention the whole tribulation and rapture piece, which can be terrifying for a child, right? It's like teaching your child that there are monsters in the closet, or that, that teaching them that their parents may just disappear one day because they're bad and they're going to get left behind because they're bad. So I do remember, kind of watched, we had a movie at our church called A Thief in the Night that they dragged all of the kids and teenagers to see. And I've heard other people talk about that being a trauma trigger for them, right? That kind of inducing a literal clinical level of what I would describe as a clinical level of fear in them, that was under certain circumstances debilitating.
So the Jim Dobson books don't trigger you too much? It's funny how you have to kind of prepare for it sometimes. That I can like prepare for certain situations if I know they're coming, but I think seeing a stack of Jim Dobson books might trigger me a little bit.
Well, I am not going to talk to you about the ultimate fate of those Jim Dobson books.
Yeah. It's funny. Probably a good choice. I was curious, when you were going through some of the skeptical parts, questioning things, not where you question yourself and your Christianity and your lack of, trust in God or whatever, but when you actually started to begin to have maybe the first cracks in the wall of your faith, did you have anyone that you felt like you could really open up to about it, or did it feel like it was more like just a journey between you and your own mind? Like, what was that like?
Well, I've said before in other contexts that one of the interesting kind of paradoxical challenges after I moved to Seattle, and I was working in therapy there to deal with some of the other stuff related to my family of origin issues. And I confessed to my therapist. He asked me who I could talk to about some of this stuff. And I said, I don't want to take anyone else to hell with me. So there was this kind of bizarre part of me. Part of me is like, I don't believe this stuff is real. And then another part of me is like, and you're going to hell because you don't believe it's real. Right.
Yeah.
And
like the tentacles are still very present.
Exactly. So I was quiet about it for a long time. I think one of the first people I explicitly asked was my brother Dan, because I think of Dan as a very smart, thoughtful, analytic person. And I said at some point to him, probably, when not long after I moved to Seattle, I said to him, so what do you make of all this stuff? Like, how do you put these pieces together? And he said, well, that's why I'm not a Christian anymore. And I was like, oh, I'm not alone here.
So that must have been a breath of fresh air to have someone you knew you could be open with about it.
Yeah. And I would say, so I'm the oldest of 6 children. Within my family, we are 3 and 3. There are 3 who are still believers, 2 of whom are very devout, in that very literalist, and one for whom it seems it's just like she's got enough other heaviness in her life that she can't really take on the burden of questioning it. That's my sister Kathy, who's chronically mentally ill, and so I think she just, to the degree that that provides comfort and community for her, I don't have a problem with that. My other two siblings, I have to confess, I'm a little bit ashamed of both of them, because I feel like they're smart enough to know better. They're smart enough to ask the questions that could show them wrong. The thought of them raising their children in this worldview without taking even a single day or week to do what you did, to examine where these beliefs came from, and to examine them through an outsider lens. And then you kind of pass this down to your kids. There's something, being the big sister and feeling somehow, I guess, still over-identified with them and over-responsible for them, I feel a little ashamed of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It feels like sometimes we do more digging about which car we might buy next year than our own eternal salvation, and whether or not this is true or not. It's like more research, on a website about a vehicle or some of the purchase than whether this is real. And it's not that hard right now, thankfully, because of the internet. It's not hard to find great information. I mean, I could drop a few names, and you look up their videos, and within a few hours you've got enough questions to say, this sounds really weird. I've honestly thought too that I don't know why I needed more information, because when you look at it, you think, shouldn't it have been enough to know that there were talking snakes, there were talking donkeys, even just the philosophy, so to speak, of the fruit tree in the garden. Like, so if you figure like Adam and Eve are basically new, they're basically like children, and naive. They may have been adults, but they were naive and innocent in the garden. So he puts these children in the garden, knowing that the enemy of their souls, that's crafty beyond crafty, is right there. And you're going to put this temptation of, oh, there's this, shiny fruit, go take it, it'll be yummy. It's like, this doesn't sound like this is real. This sounds made up. If it is real, it sounds awful. And then of course you add it, the Noah stuff, the genocide. I mean, it goes on, land theft, slavery, to child brides or worse, which equates to human trafficking, the slavery, the beating of slaves, misogyny, genital mutilation. It just goes, stoning. It goes on and on. And it's like, do you really want to teach kids this? That's actually what it didn't get me out, but it started where I was singing with the kids, as you do as a good Christian parent. You teach them the Bible songs, and singing Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. And it just struck me one night, I know what the next verse says, with them going in and slaughtering people, but save the young virgins for yourselves. And it's like, I thought, do I really feel comfortable with they're going to learn sometime what happens in the next verse of this story, so to speak. And that was the very first step. It should have got me out. It didn't. That was not enough. It should have been enough. It took me a serious study for about 18 months of the origins of Christianity, where it really came from. But it's like, I kind of feel ashamed, like I shouldn't have needed that. It should have been enough to just say, this is a really bad book. And it's funny too, and just as a side note, I'll wrap this part up, but when Christians question us and say, well, where do you get your morality from? It's like, so wait, your God does all these horrible things, the genocide, the slavery, the land theft, all this stuff, kidnapping, and then you're going to question me where I get my morality from? Like, it blows my mind. But that's part of the dissonance. And I can admit, when I was in it, I didn't feel the dissonance. I could explain it away when I was a Christian. And so it's the hard part for me. And I want to ask you this. No one ever actually put the ball in my court. Like, no one ever actually said, hey, Tim, when I was a Christian, no one ever said, hey, Tim, do you realize there's genocide all over this book? What do you do with it? Do you realize it says you can have a slave, you can bequeath them to kids, you can beat your slaves until they're almost dead, blah, blah, blah. No one ever said, Tim, answer all those questions for me, or else your religion sounds like garbage. I was kind of sheltered, and no one ever really attacked my Christianity. But I feel like if someone had, I kind of would have had an obligation to actually deal with it. And I feel like that's where it frustrates me when I do bring these issues up to Christians, and they just kind of do It's like now you've been brought front and center. You have no more excuse. You know it's in your book. If you never read it, I just told you it's in your book, and they still kind of excuse it. I mean, does that bother you when you've gotten that far in a conversation with people and they still kind of just, oh, God's the king, he can do what he wants?
I struggle with that aspect of human nature more broadly. So when I look at Christianity, I would say I now think of Christianity as a form of viral self-replicator, right? That it is a meme complex is the term that some people have used, but that is has been tailored over generations of selective pressures to evade our bullshit detectors, right? So that experience that you have in a movie where you're going along with the plot, we know that movie plots are oversimplified, that kind of people talk and act in ways that people don't really talk and act, that there's kind of these credible like leaps of logic and kind of tweaking of reality. And yet our brain will go along with it. And then sometimes every once in a while you hit something that just kicks you out of the plot because it's, kind of for whatever reason, you've been kind of going along with all of these things that are utterly impossible. And then something happens that's also impossible, equally impossible. And your brain goes, come on. Right.
Yeah. And it kind of ruins it for you.
I think so. Christianity has been selected over time to not trigger our bullshit detectors, right? I mean, Andy Thompson's book and his YouTube video, Why We Believe in Gods, I think gives us some inkling of what part of that is at least. But I also think that just in general, our human information processing is very imperfect, right? And it's a value to us to know what's real. And so we care deeply about figuring out what's real and what are the real world contingencies that govern our well-being. That's important to us because reality can whomp you hard when you get it wrong, right? And yet what we also know is that there are huge flaws in our ability to discern what's real and what's true. And we see that, I think, right now all around us with the how come I can't say proliferation all of a sudden? I can't speak English. But, like there's that new movie, The Social Dilemma, that talks about the ways that social media are really altering our sense of reality. And as information flow bifurcates and then rebifurcates, it's so easy for us to end up in these little isolated communities in which confirmatory thinking reinforces whatever it is that we might have had some mild predilection to believe in the first place. And then we become true believers, right? So there's this guy, Tristan Harris, who I recommend. He was an early ethicist at Google. And you can find an interview or two interviews with him on Sam Harris's podcast, but he was also part of the movie, The Social Dilemma. And he talks about it as one of those podcasts is titled The Cult Factory. And I think it's because this is happening in a way that is unprecedented, that these new technologies have allowed for people to go into these kind of cult-like belief systems in a way that we didn't anticipate. And I think we don't know quite what to do with it or how to prevent that from fracturing our society to the point that we are potentially at arms, right? At war with each other. So Christianity has had a long time to be refined in a way that allows it to just squeak past all of those cognitive defenses against untruth and unreality. Yeah,
that's a really good way to put it. I was going to say it's very timely too with all the things going on here with around the election and start of Joe Biden's presidency. It's very relevant, and it feels like some of these issues of the cognitive dissonance, the blinders that we all have, the cult-like aspect of both religion and even of politics and of our little social cliques. It's like some of the issues that got some of us out of religion, like those kind of transcend some of these other topics a little bit. And I don't want to get into that per se today to get us off track, but it's very relevant. And
it is very relevant. And let me just say that I actually think that it's I think there's an important role for former true believers to play in this current context, right?
Yeah.
I tend to be left of center in my political beliefs, and kind of partly because I'm passionately conservative about the environment, and so a kind of impassioned environmentalist. But like I wrote an article that the title is "The Righteous and the Woke: Why Evangelicals and Social Justice Warriors Trigger Me in the Same Way." And it's because I think that that some of the psychology of the way that these belief systems that are playing out, I think that there's this kind of something called critical theory, critical race theory, critical gender theory on the left that many people are internalizing and experiencing in a way that is very similar to what I experience in evangelical Christianity, and not recognizing that it is a template for kind of potentially analyzing or assessing kind of the world around you, that it has the potential to unveil certain truths and obscure others, and that it, kind of is, instead what you have is people who are true believers and thinking that they have, that they've just participated in the I Found It campaign, and that they need to go out and evangelize the rest of the world around them. And so, like, I'm not deep enough in some of the conspiracy theories and such on the right to kind of firsthand experience some of those similar dynamics. And yet, looking at it externally, they also, I think, there has to be something very similar going on in some other communities where I don't really have a window into exactly how that's being formulated and played out. So I think former evangelicals, former fundamentalists, like, I come out of that experience with a very deep wariness of groupthink.
Yeah.
And very, like, kind of like fooled me once. Like, I'm not interested in orthodoxies. If you say something is unquestionable, that makes me want to question it. Yep. And, if there are taboos, I kind of instinctivly want to kind of hold them up to the light and examine them, and sometimes violate them just because they're taboos. So there's the kind of reactive, kind of perhaps adolescent side of that. But I also think that we know something that a lot of people who have never experienced this kind of groupthink, that they don't know. It hasn't happened to them before.
Yeah, it's almost like once you've left Christianity, you've got a little bit of the tools, the equipment to work through some of these. But if you've never worked through them, it's hard. It's really hard for a lot of us, just the psychology of it all. It's really hard for us to deeply question ourselves, especially if we're surrounded by people that we can just tell they're good people. They know that this is true, and that, our preacher and our parents. And it's hard work. It's a hard human challenge to be able to question, the big party lines. And I feel bad for people that are stuck in it, because some of it's like, it feels like they never actually get to start living. Like, to me, that's one of the hardest parts for me about seeing children in Christianity is like it scares me to think, if I had never deconverted, if I had never done the research I had done, like, I could have spent my entire life, or maybe, what if I, realized it was all fake when I was, 80, 85 years old and about to, pass away. Like, wow, I've got like 6 months to live, and that's all I've got to actually live with a real perception of reality. I wasted my whole life in this fantasy world, and it breaks my heart on all these levels to think about people that just never get a chance to see reality. And it's also, some of it's really, it's so unnecessary. I mean, some battles are worth fighting. Some battles are worth, not physically fighting per se, but just, going through the intellectual, like, what about this? What about that? There's different rights issues that are going on, and it's worth it to have good arguments and read good books. But just to be able to actually, like some of this stuff is just not worth it. We're going to literally blow ourselves up. And it's like, it breaks my heart, but that'll be a topic for another time. I do want to ask, just going back to your story, before our time is up, in terms of like the final steps, when you finally came, I'll describe it as like coming up to the door of deconversion, but you haven't opened the door yet. You're right there. Things have fallen apart. What was it that took you over that threshold? Like, what enabled you to make the final steps, and could you just maybe describe in a few words what that process was like? Did it take you a day, a week, a year? What took you from, I may have issues with God in my relationship, but I'm a believer. I believe God is God and Jesus is his son. The gospel is what saves us, to I'm out. Like, what was that final process like?
I mean, it's hard to answer. I would say part of the two things that were key for me were compassion and anger. So, you said that theodicy wasn't a core factor for you, but I think it was for me. And then just getting pissed off about it, right? That feeling like if the Christian God existed, he was a jerk. Yeah. And that there were cruelties that were inexcusable, and unjustifiable. So after that experience at Children's Hospital, I don't remember it being a particularly big deal. It just felt like the work had already been done, and it faded away. I didn't think a whole lot more about it. In my arrogance, Valerie being the center of the universe, just assumed that other people outgrew it too, for lack of a better way to put it. And it wasn't really until George Bush got elected, and then kind of with a strong evangelical support, despite some of the warmongering. And then, at that point, there was this real surge in the religious right as a political entity. And for reasons that you may be familiar with, evangelicals had also basically built their own media empires and had taken over the airwaves, so that the dominant strain of Christianity that one would experience on the airwaves in America was biblical literalism of the kind that I grew up in. And when it became clear that that point of view had become politically ascendant, I think that it was shaping our society. I kind of got smacked away from my belief that it's just a developmental process and everybody else is going to kind of see what I saw. And so that was what prompted me to write Trusting Doubt, because all of a sudden I was like, whoa, if we're having a public conversation about Christianity, there's some things in my head that I have kept quiet for a long time. They haven't been front and center for me, but like they're there. And partly I kept quiet about them because I was being deferential and polite. But, kind of if gloves are off, then there's some things I want to say.
That's awesome. What do you remember any parts of it where you kind of got shaken up by realizations? Like, did it shake you up when you realized that they're just to be able to verbalize, I don't think there's a God, or I don't think there's an afterlife? Like, and where are you with that? I guess I should ask first. And if you are, on the path or on the spot of saying, I don't think those things exist, was that hard to deal with when you first realized it?
No, it wasn't. I mean, people have said, what do you call yourself? And I'm like, well, I could call myself an atheist, and then I lack any kind of theistic God belief. I could call myself an agnostic because I believe there are things that are essentially unknowable, and that it's even possible to define God in a way that is untestable, unfalsifiable. I, could call myself a naturalist in that I think that the naturalistic epistemologies are all we've got, essentially. I have sometimes called myself a spiritual non-theist, because then people say, well, what does that mean? And then I get to say I lack a humanoid God concept, but I believe that issues of meaning and morality are at the very heart of what it is to be a human being. I haven't missed having a God. It's like, and I think for me, it's like once I see something, I can't unsee it. I think that's true for a lot of us. And once I saw that this God was fabricated, I couldn't not see that. And then it was over the course of many years of writing about Christianity, which I wrote for online news and opinion sites for almost a decade, that I really got deeper into some of the other things that people might have expected me to kick me out of Christianity, like some of the things you talked about, the horrific biblical stance on slavery or the genocides or the incredibly deep misogyny that is woven into the fabric of scriptures. So like all of those things just didn't trouble me that much until much later when I circled back and looked at them.
It's ironic how much we can put things into buckets and kind of ignore the bad stuff. Well, I wanted to wrap up by just asking you kind of about the healing part of it, the catharsis. Was writing your books cathartic in all this, and whether it was or not, were there any other parts of your journey, especially at that time when you began to write the books and began to really talk more about it, that like how did you heal from some of the stuff? Because for some of us it really is, it's not just a flipping a switch. It's not just checking different boxes. Now, I was Republican, now I'm Democrat, or vice versa. I was a Christian, now I'm not. It's not just a flip of a switch. It's a very traumatic thing. Some of us, myself included, still want to live forever, and it's hard to deal with that reality that that's not going to happen. Some of us, it was real. I had a 1,000-page prayer book I had written I was going to publish. My prayer life was real, and it was vibrant, and it meant a lot to me. And to realize this has never been real was extremely painful to me. And as much as you could say, well, you should have known better, blah, 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 it's just stupid. It may have been stupid, but to me it was real. It was absolutely real. And it's like the yes is so critical. And I've heard of stories where people get depressed for a while, which is totally understandable. It's nothing to be ashamed of. But like, how did you deal with the healing process, and what were the kind of the high points of kind of getting back to being able to, take a deep breath and just enjoy life again the way you should have maybe from the start?
I had the good fortune of, by the time I left Christianity altogether, being immersed in a very secular community. So living in Seattle among mental health professionals and folks in tech, both of which are kind of more secular than average communities, because I think because in tech you have this sort of analytic thinking of, that's kind of very methodical. And I think in psychology, what you have is a whole bunch of a more nuanced, complex set of hypotheses about why people do the things they do that aren't just about sin and salvation, right? So by that, so I didn't really have to go through that kind of a healing process like some people did. I think I went through that trauma and healing way back when I was at Wheaton, when I had gotten to the point of trying to commit suicide over my bulimia, because if I couldn't pray it away, that meant I was a terrible Christian. And so it was a kind of spiritual indictment of me that was, kind of profound and deep and, in my mind, unrecoverable. So that by the time I actually shook off the last of my faith, I had moved into forms of Christianity that in general are more benign. So that, like, I think we often find that when people are coming out of the mainline denominations, or they're coming out of more liberal theologies and moving away from a belief in a God who was not so punitive as the God that you and I believed in, that they often do have less trauma and less needed healing. They simply kind of move on with it just seems like a natural progression for them, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that because I was so slow and that kind of delayed in that way, that by the time I got there wasn't a lot of healing left to do.
Did it take a while to get over the whole reflex of, oh gosh, I'm even, like, in a joking sense, like I'm going to burn in hell, like I don't want to lead other people into hell? Did the hell reflex like die pretty quickly after that, or was it a while? I've heard of people that still kind of wake up with sweats about that, even though they intellectually know it's not real, but it still kind of has its roots in them. Did that take a while, or did that go over quickly?
It didn't, and in part because that was one of the things that made Christianity untenable, was this belief in hell, right? The idea that this God was somehow perfect and loving, and that was compatible with torturing people forever, that, kind of the idea that Christians in heaven were going to be blissfully happy, completely indifferent to the idea that people were being tortured with maximum suffering. And, like, I don't find that I'm completely indifferent to suffering on the other side of the world. So why would I be indifferent to people suffering in hell, right? It either means I have to be ignorant of it when I'm in heaven, or it means that I'm uncaring. And both of those are kind of heinous conditions for some sort of eternal bliss.
Yeah.
Now, I wrote an article at one point about, titled, I think, Why Christian Heaven Would Actually Be Hell. And if you look closely at the you add up the ideas of what Christians believe heaven to be, including the idea of eternity, it's really, really awful. Non-existence is far preferable.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's amazing as a maybe a humorous side note. Looking at heaven in terms of the description of Revelation, the book of Revelation. I know it's elsewhere in the Bible, but in case a lot of Christians didn't know it and they're watching this, your version of heaven is not just dominated by God's glory and sinlessness, it's dominated by none other than Pythagoras. Look deeply at the math around the dimensions of heaven. Pythagoras is all over it. It's amazing. Have you ever dove into that, by the way?
No, never.
How about John 21 with the fish?
No, never.
So the story was, if I'm remembering correctly, Pythagoras, who was a long time before Jesus was, he had this story told about him where he was passing by these fishermen, and he made some kind of bet with them. He said, if I can guess how many fish you're about to pull out of your nets, will you please promise to let them go? And if I'm remembering correctly, again, memory fails me probably on some of the details, but apparently he won, and they had to put the fish back. But in the story, it doesn't say how many fish he doesn't say, this was the prediction was this, and they just said, you got it right. Well, Pythagoreans, they loved magic numbers. The world to them is just pure magic numbers. Everything's numbers. And one of the biggest numbers that they loved, for reasons I'll go into another time, is 153. That was a Pythagorean hotspot number. So you get to John 21, and Jesus says, cast in your nets and pull in some fish. And they cast their nets and they pull in fish and they count them. And lo and behold, it's exactly 153. That book has more about Pythagoras than I think most Christians realize. Anyway, it's fun. It's fun to learn where it all came from.
Well, I think that, kind of some folk, the question of, is the Bible mythologized history or historicized mythology, right? I'm never going to know the answer to that. It's clear that it's one or the other, right? And that there are these heavy dose parts of the New Testament that, if there is some historical, iconoclastic Hebrew rabbi, beneath the surface of the legends, we're never going to know who that person actually was. Yeah, very true. And there's so much. And I in case anybody isn't sure what we're talking about that's watching, I really encourage you to watch. I can get in touch with me. There's some other groups. I'll put some links beneath the video, but there's a lot of cool stuff. I mean, it's honestly, when you step away from it and stop looking at it like as a literal fundamentalist Christian, where you're like, oh, this is garbage, that's bullshit. But when you just step back at it, it's actually quite a fascinating book. But you can't look at it through the old lens anymore. But once you step away, kind of heal a little bit and come back to it. Like I was just interviewing a gentleman named Bill Darlison, who's a Unitarian preacher, retired over in England. And he wrote a book called The Zodiac in the Gospels. And he's pointed out, when you look at the Gospel of Mark, the Zodiac is in the stories in the right order. It's like, well, is this a star story or is this Jesus? Which one is it? It's fascinating, but it's really so cool to realize that they use some very different influences. And I'm sure you've dove into the whole Dennis MacDonald stuff with how Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey is the how Luke and Acts were rewritten. But it's so amazing. And once you learn it, it's like you said, you can't unlearn it. You're like, oh, so this is a star story heavily based on
Pythagoras, heavily influenced by Homer and Virgil and Euripides. And it's like, once you start pulling apart the layers, you're like, this doesn't sound right. In terms of being a literal history of a real God, this sounds like a very man-made book with a whole bunch of different influences, but that'll be a topic maybe for another day. But it is fun to talk about it a little bit, and I appreciate your bantering on that with me.
Absolutely.
Could I ask, just to wrap this up, could you maybe give just a word of advice for anybody who's kind of lost in all this, who's saying, I don't think Christianity necessarily is true, but I'm not sure? What would you say would be a kind of a good first step, or even a good first thought to think about to begin the journey of doing some of this research and digging, and not necessarily in terms of origins of Christianity, but just digging through the philosophy of it all, of thinking through it? Like, when you can tell someone's kind of finally the lights are kind of flashing, how do you tell people, hey, it's going to be okay, let's start this journey, let's go this route? Like, what does that look like?
Well, so I think from a spiritual standpoint, one motto I heard in college, in fact, I thought it was Wheaton College's motto for a while, was all truth is God's truth. So if you assume that we small humans have a limited, that there is some God, and that we small humans have some limited capacity to comprehend God, and that we are going to tend in our human way to project ourselves onto the world around us, and because each of us is the center of our own universe, and then I think that gives some permission to keep asking questions. If you say all truth is God's truth, that we can't be afraid of digging in to kind of try and figure out what's real and what's true, right? I think the second thing I would say is that, our spiritual ancestors, including the men who wrote the Bible books, were doing the best they could under the circumstances available to them, their Iron Age context, with the knowledge, the scientific knowledge that was available to them, with the cultural context that surrounded them, with the ideas and thoughts and information that were handed down to them by their ancestors. Each of them took all of that and asked themselves a set of questions about what's real and what's good. And, kind of to them, what's good was kind of synonymous, I think, with what is God. And then how do we live in moral community with each other? And each of them didn't just take what was handed down to them, they repackaged it. We know that because, like, if they had just taken what was handed down to them, they wouldn't have needed to write it, right? So what they wrote was their own synthesis, integration, reformulation of whatever was handed down to them. And so what I think is that, you can honor their words, or you can honor their process, but you can't honor both.
Yeah.
So you have to choose, when you look at the Bible and the Bible writers, which of those two things you're going to honor. The third thing I think I would say has to do with more kind of putting on my psychologist hat, that it like, we're all wired for continuity and familiarity and comfort, and it's can be very uncomfortable, especially in the context of so we're all kind of drinking from an information fire hose, and so much misinformation is coming at us, and it's hard to know what's real. And I think increasingly people can feel like they're drowning in that. And yet, even so, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes there are things that we can't necessarily know what is real, but there's a lot of things that we can know are not real. And I think it's okay to kind of give yourself permission to live with a lot of unknowns, and also to kind of live with some things that you've ruled out, right? So someone who I quoted in my book said, I would rather live with unanswered questions than unquestioned answers. And that can be challenging because our brains want to close those gaps. But it can also be wonderful in that it opens up, as you said earlier, all kinds of possibilities that are closed off when you've got this worldview that binds you to a set of ancestors that were the best, or answers that were the best our spiritual ancestors could come up with during the Iron Age. Right?
Yeah.
We've got a lot of advantages they didn't have.
Yeah. That's a great perspective, and I completely agree. And yeah, there's ways to definitely honor what's come before us, and yet choose a better path in a sense to take the exploration and the journey and to take it to the next level. And I think it was Christopher Hitchens who said something like, "This was humanity's, first effort, and it was therefore, our worst. It was, it was our first one, so it was inherently flawed. It was, our beta version. It was, draft 1.0. Now it's time for 2.0, and it's definitely cool to be able to, as a hopefully, I don't want to sound like I'm a PhD or anything, but like trying to be a scholar, as I think most Christians that I've seen that deconvert want to do. They want to understand where did this come from, to look at that with a respectful eye to the past, but also to say I can and will say I don't want to support certain things like the genocide and the slavery and even the things just to kids, saying, "Hey, kids, believe or you're going to burn in hell." And it is refreshing to me to take that power. It's like it's a power thing to say, not in a negative sense, but just to say I have the power. I spent my whole life kind of thinking God's the judge, he's the king, and just to say I'm not elevating myself, but I'm just to say I do have the power to assess and say I don't agree with that, so I'm going to walk away from it. I don't agree with that, I'm going to walk away from it. And it's hard. When you're a Christian, that's blasphemy. You don't question God. But to give yourself that power and to say I'm okay saying I don't approve of a book with genocide, and yet like you said, to still respect where it all came from, but to move on to something better is really it's a cool self. It's healing. It's healing to give yourself that freedom, because it's almost like the people that never learn how to say no. Like, I don't want that. I don't want that. Just, the first time you realize I can say no, I don't want that. I want this. And it's like, it kind of builds you up and you're like, oh, okay, I guess I do have the freedom to do that. And it's empowering, but it's hard. It takes a lot of guts if you're not used to it. But
and you realize there's a whole world out there, right? I mean, part
Yes.
of Christianity's immune system is to teach you to be afraid of the world out there.
Yes.
And then you get out there and you find kindness, you find compassion, you find beauty. When I was a Christian, an evangelical believer, the people I thought of as my spiritual kin, because Christianity is focused on belief, on orthodoxies, on right belief, the people I thought of as my spiritual kin were people who, like me, believed that Jesus was the Son of God, our Savior, who had kind of come to sacrifice himself to propitiate the sins of the world, and that the Bible was the literally perfect word of God. And when I first kind of deconverted, I thought my spiritual kin were people who, like me, had shed those childhood beliefs or childish beliefs, kind of, and it took me a while to realize that even that way of thinking, that it's about right belief, was something that was a Christian box that I was being put in, right? And so when I think now, who are my spiritual kin? It's not necessarily people who believe like me. It's people who share my spiritual values. And when I think of that, even I might use the words of the prophet to walk humbly, to love, to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's about kind of who shares my what I care about in the world, about kind of kindness, about compassion, about stewardship. And those people might come from many kinds of belief traditions, right? Some of them might be evangelical Christians,
Yeah.
and some of them might be hardcore atheists, and some of them might come from other faith traditions. But I feel like what it is about is values and praxis. Like, how are we living into the world around us, and like, who do we love? How do we care for? And kind of how do we love, and how do we kind of live into the goodness that is possible in this one precious life.
Yeah. That's a good reminder too, to build bridges, to not burn them. Like, I think a lot of us get tempted to burn bridges or to walk away from a lot of stuff, and to try to keep building if we can, as much as possible, and keep those friendships going. And it's a lot of good stuff, a lot of meat to chew in there. But I appreciate you doing this. I know we're out of time, but I've only got about 45 more questions, so hopefully sometime we can do it again. But
I'd be happy to find time to just talk with you again as you're kind of continuing your journey and thinking about what comes next, and what are some things that are worth saying, both exploring for yourself and saying on the air.
Thank you. Yeah, and I definitely will try to get to your books too, to read them. I've not read them yet, but I've seen a bunch of your videos. But I'll try to read your books too, and so I can dig in a little deeper there. But Dr. Tarico, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it, especially with your busyness and your travels. Thank you for all that you've been doing and all that you do. And we just appreciate your voice in all these matters. It's been very, very, very helpful. I mean, honestly, I've gone back to several of your videos several times, so I encourage other people to do so as well. Thank you for what you're doing for the atheists and for the other communities that you speak to, and look forward to the next time.
Thank you.